for example, attention, would be considered the software. Alright. So, if we're looking at this for us, from a movement perspective, we're going to say, let's say we see a ball, right? So that's the sensory input. There's a ball flying through the air. Right? In the processing box, lots of things have to happen now. A, I have to recognize it's a ball. Right? So I've got to recognize the stimulus. Then the really tricky bit, I have to make a decision on what I'm going to do. Because I could catch the ball, I could kick the ball, I could hit the ball, I could header the ball, I could duck out of the way of the ball because I don't know what to do with it. Right? Lots and lots and lots of different reactions to what seeing a ball means. Right? So this is massive. Okay, decision making. What am I going to do with the ball? Once we've got a decision, okay, then we have to, what's a word I can use here? Then we have to initiate the movement in response to the decision that is appropriate for the decision. And then our output is the observable movement that occurs. Sense. So this is a very, as I said, this is a very simplified version of an information processing model. They get much more complicated the more you get into it. But this is a basic idea of information processing. Right? Information processing, as I said, it was like the new thing when I went to school. So all the textbooks were talking about information processing and different theories that lie under this umbrella. Schmitt's schema theory and some others. Right? And this predominated all the way through until we got to ecological dynamical systems constraints theory, which is a long way in the future. Right? So a lot of research that we look at is based in an information approach. Okay? It's still today a very valid way to run your research agenda. Right? When I first came to graduate school, that was 2001, when you went to go to conferences, there was a very distinct division between the people that ran their research using information processing and the people who ran their research using dynamical systems or constraints theory. And they just would bat heads all the time. Now, over the last 5-8 years, people have started going, you know what, we don't need to bat heads. We can combine these two approaches and have a stronger research agenda. Right? So finally, we're all talking to each other, and I think that that's going to really progress motor behavior research. Okay? So this one, as I say, really came to the fore early mid-70s, so it's old, but it's still a very valid approach. So don't write this one off. Okay? idea of perceptual motor development in chapter 11. It's a subfield of information processing, and they're looking at the development and the interaction between sensory information and perceptual abilities, and how those perceptual abilities are linked to motor skills. So particularly things like balance, catching, right? So much of chapter 11 comes back to the information that we have in chapter 11 was based on research that was done using an information processing approach. Okay, so when we get there, try to remember that link back. So here's our triangle. All right, remember our triangle. We've got our individual, and we can have either structural to do with the body or functional to do with behavioral, emotional type issues. We've got our task constraints. Okay, so the goal of the what is the task, the goal of the task, the rules for the task, the equipment you use for the task. And we have our environmental constraints that can be physical, like gravity, or sociocultural, like gender. Okay. And the ecological perspective kind of started showing its face around the mid-late 80s, but it didn't really get going until into the 90s. And the ecological perspective can be used to describe, to predict motor development. The information processing tends to be more about what's happening in the brain in response to that signal for this to be the output that we see. All right? So the fact that they were arguing was kind of pointless in the first place because they were looking at different things, really. They're not, it's like apples and oranges, right? They're not two types of apples, these two theories. They're really looking at different things. And when we look at anything under ecological perspective, that nervous system that was all important back in the maturational perspective now is just one of many, many systems within the individual that act as constraints to the motor pattern that we see. At any one time, one system might have more influence than another. So when we go through puberty, the rate that our skeleton changes in size, so our skeletal system, drives a lot of change in movement patterns. Right? So during puberty, our skeletal system and our muscular system play a big role in what I end up seeing that individual do. As an adult, the skeletal system doesn't have anything to do with, right? Because it doesn't change anymore. Okay? That makes sense? So it depends, you know, at certain times across the lifespan, certain systems are more important, but generally we're looking at the interaction of all the systems driving that movement pattern. Right? So how I move isn't just related to the environment and the task, but also to my body, to my mind, this interplay of many, many different constraints. Right? So my information processing approach says we have a central governor, brain, and the decision making and driving a neural signal to the muscles that create a movement. The ecological perspective want to say, no, perception's direct and my body can self-assemble in response to that signal. So if I step on a rock and I turn my ankle, that signal doesn't have to consciously be thought about to pull my foot back in line. My body will reorganize my step pattern and I'll get my balance back and I'll be back on track. Right? So it's not a right and a wrong, it's different. Right? That's all. Okay? All right, so again, we're only going to look very briefly at dynamical systems because it's a hugely complicated mathematical model and we have our nice constraints theory as a simplified version that we can use for applied work, coaching and teaching people. Okay? So dynamical systems theory was developed in astrophysics, I think. It was kind of stolen by different other areas of research and eventually got to the movement world in the early 80s, and these researchers were the first ones to kind of publish a paper that looked at how could we use this dynamical systems within a movement perspective. The key point for dynamical systems is that body systems, as I just said, they're not driven solely by the central nervous system. They can spontaneously self-organize themselves into a movement pattern that works at that point. So remember the example I gave last week about the big flock of starlings? Right? If you're lucky enough to get to see a huge flock of starlings at sunset, it's called a murmur. They all move as one body. It's an amazing thing to watch. Right? And that whole pattern of movement contains thousands and thousands of birds. The idea is that they're self-organizing into this pattern. There's going to be a reason why, but they're not talking to each other, and there isn't one bird that's saying, okay, everybody do this. Right? The whole flock organizes itself. So if you think of each bone in your arm or each bone in your leg as a separate starling, my brain might initiate the walk, but the murmur can self-organize the movement pattern to deal with an uneven surface. Everyone's gone a little blank on me here. Ish. So here we say movements are soft-wired rather than hard-wired, right? I can adapt the movement if something changes. If you are visual and you like pictures, there's a set of graphs trying to show how the systems interact. If you're not visual and the graphs don't help, ignore them. Okay? But if, say, that's your skeletal system, and this is your muscular system, and this is your digestive system, and this is your nervous system, they're all going to interact and the picture's going to look like this. Right? Don't worry about it. If they don't help, ignore them. Just think about the fact that When we're young, some systems might develop more quickly than others. When we're older, certain systems are going to start to deteriorate before other systems, and that might impact the motor pattern that you see, all right, because of the interaction. Right, so as you get older, your eyesight changes a lot. And that impacts motor patterns. My eyesight changes much earlier than my skeletal system or my muscular system changes. So I have to adapt, even though I'm still strong and I'm still balanced, but I can't see properly under certain circumstances. Let me have a look here. All right. So on Wednesday, we're going to look at the idea of perception and action, right? So they're coupled together, they're linked very, very strongly, okay? They evolve together. If I'm going to move, I have to be able to perceive my environment. Right? So if I'm going to perceive my environment, I have to be able to move. So for example, if I'm standing here, if a spaceship dropped me out of thin air and dumped me here, how would I know there was a corridor out there unless I can move across the room and see the door in the corridor? Right? So if I want to perceive something, I need to be able to move. And if I want to move, I have to be able to perceive my environment. That's why blind people have to have other strategies to move around, right? Because they can't directly perceive the desk because it doesn't make a noise. Okay. So we're going to come back and look at this idea of this coupling together of what I perceive about my environment and movement and how they kind of grow together as we develop. Right? So what I want you to do, I know it's a holiday weekend and that's great. Enjoy the holiday weekend, get some sleep, eat some nice food, don't drink and drive. Okay? I'm not saying don't drink, because that would be hypocritical of me. Do not drink and drive.
I got you.
Okay? But what I want you to do is have a very quick look at the dynamical systems idea, information processing, and a very brief glance at the key points for perception action, so that when you come in on Wednesday, we don't have quite so much blank going on. All right? Okay? All right. Have a super